Last summer, we found a small set of artifacts that opened up a mystery for us. Obsidian cores that were buried in the ground. These were the materials of a prehistoric toolmaker who had carried them some distance. He had then stopped, reworked them, and buried them with the intention of coming back. But for some reason, he never returned.
Few people are accustomed to thinking about California ever having had a Stone Age. But up until the time that European miners and other settlers began flooding into the area about 150 years ago, much of the state was inhabited by very sophisticated Stone Age people who'd lived here and wrested a living from the land for 10,000 years or more.
Unlike the miners who sought gold for the easy riches it would bring them, the native cultures of this region sought a different rock, precious to them for their very survival.
Obsidian, black glass. Among Native American cultures, there's no more important resource that you could have. It was sharper than bone, it was sharper than stone, it was rare. It would be even sharper than the iron tools brought later by the miners.
And nowhere did Native Americans use obsidian more extensively, trade it more prodigiously, mine it more unceasingly for thousands of years than in one hidden, almost impenetrable valley in eastern California.
Owens Valley, it seems almost frozen in time. If you walk the valley floor and pay attention to the ground, you'll notice that it's littered with obsidian arrows and chips. Those chips are from ancient travelers making their own tools. As an archaeologist interested in California's prehistory, those obsidian chips literally are our trail markers to the past.
Owens Valley sits at the border between two great geographic provinces. On the west, you have the Sierra Nevada with its peaks rising to over 14,000 feet, dotted with alpine lakes. Then you drop over 10,000 feet to the valley, and then in a few miles you rise again to 14,000 feet in the White Inyo Mountains with its dry, sere, bristlecone pine forest. Owens Valley is a pretty long valley. It goes for about 150 miles. It's one of the most volcanically active regions in North America, and Highway 395 runs right through it.
Into this landscape, glaciers would encroach episodically in 5 distinct periods. About 12,000 years ago, the last of these glacial waves began to recede, and the massive desert lakes they sustained across the Great Basin began to dry up. In Owens Valley, the saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth would disappear along with the melting ice. Until finally, humans would venture in. By the time Euro-Americans arrived, the land was fully inhabited by the Paiute.
There are such extremes in this area from the valley floor that's to the tops of the mountains that the Paiute people were in good shape. They could walk for days. They had to learn to run at a good pace and never get tired. They traveled at great distances for everything they needed, from the obsidian to the pine nuts to the mountain sheep.
The Owens Valley Paiutes are a transitional people between the classical California culture to the west of them and the Great Basin desert cultures to the east. They live in a territory blessed with great variations of elevation, environmental conditions, and food resources. Their adaptive ability to survive and thrive in this territory is a testament to these people.
Winters were typically spent in the valley, where temperatures were warmer. By midsummer, the widely scattered food supply would force the Paiute to travel into the pine forest of the nearby mountains, where edible plants and mountain game were more abundant. As the game traveled still higher, so would the Paiute in pursuit. Archaeologists would find above tree-line encampments at elevations in excess of 11,000 feet, near the very crest of the White Mountains.
Fall was one of the most important times of the year. It was the time when you collected the pine nuts. The Pine nuts, which we call tuba, were one of our most important food sources. They helped us survive through harsh winters. Their nutrition was almost like taking a vitamin.
They would travel quite a ways to gather pine nuts. They would spend days or weeks, a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks up in the mountain gathering food. That way they would have enough to carry them over in the wintertime and also enough to trade for something else that they would like to have for the wintertime.
There's ample documentation about Paiute lifeways in the recent end of the prehistoric past. But what about further back in time? What do we know about lifeways 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago?
Could science look into the prehistoric past and reveal the nature of an ancient people's lifeway? And what would be found? Would it be the story of changes over time in the very existence and survival patterns of a native peoples? Or would it be the story of a culture remaining unchanged for thousands of years?
As archaeologists, these are the mysteries and questions of the past that we seek to answer.
Establish the datum for the excavation grid somewhere over here inside the right-of-way fence.
Okay, right up against the road.
Much of the modern-day funding for archaeology in the United States comes as a result of proposed large-scale building projects. State and federal laws require that archaeological investigations be conducted on most lands slated for development. The Owens Valley region is no exception. Over the last 30 years, the California Department of Transportation, known as Caltrans, has been expanding Highway 395 to 4 lanes. By funding studies along the expansion route, Caltrans has become the dominant sponsor of archaeology in the region. "15 years ago, archaeologists uncovered one of the most extensive prehistoric village sites thus far found in the valley. The site lies just south of Lone Pine.
This is Inyo 30. It's not much to look at now. Behind me, several miles, is the dry bed of the Owens Lake. Steamships used to cross this lake in the late 1800s. The stream, since diverted by the LA Aqueduct, runs right past the site. You take the lake and the stream in the nearby Sierra Nevadas, and this was a perfect place to camp. Now, archaeologists find Inyo 30 interesting because it just wasn't occupied once or twice. It was occupied multiple times over a 7,000-year period.
Work at this site would uncover hundreds of artifacts from each period of occupation.
The oldest material we found at Inyo 30 dated between 7,000 and 3,000 years ago. We found shipping debris and spear points that were probably used to kill antelope and bighorn sheep. We really didn't find much more than that, and we didn't find any houses or structures. Now, artifacts from the most recent occupation, starting about 1,000 years ago, show that the site was occupied on a much more permanent basis. We find large bedrock milling complexes. We find charred seeds, and for the first time, the charred remains of pine nut. And instead of the large spear points, we now find many, many small projectile points.
As is often the case in scientific discovery, the excavation at Inyo 30 created as many new questions about prehistoric culture as it answered.
Inyo 30 tells us that at the beginning of California's Stone Age, people lived a lot differently than they did at the end. 7,000 years ago, they were eating more large game and probably living in small temporary camps. By 1,000 years ago, all that had changed. Complex houses and villages appear, and their diet had shifted from one emphasizing large game to now focusing on small game and plants.